For a couple of years in 2005, 2006, I did a series of work based around walks around particular areas of New York City. I would go out and try to choose a general vicinity that I wanted to move around in without any particular idea of needing to go to a place. It was just about moving through space. While walking, I would take a lot of photographs of sort of shapes and forms and things that caught my eye that I felt were endemic of that neighborhood. At the same time, I was also wearing a small device called a pedometer. So by the time I got back to my studio, not only did I have a number of photographs of the environment, but I knew exactly how many steps I took, exactly how much time, exactly how much distance. And I was very interested in this idea of sort of building quantities of information around something as simple as taking a walk. And what I would do with the information was use it as a way of rebuilding my experience through painting and drawing, rebuilding my experience of the walk itself. So instead of trying to document the walk, I actually build information and then use the information to get back to the walk. By 2007, 2008, I started to think about digging into the particular areas of the information themselves. And I started to become fascinated with trying to work with some of the set shapes that I had pulled out of the photographs in and of themselves. So I started by just taking all of the shapes from these 9 walks that I did, putting them into a grid, and having them punched out of steel. So this sculpture is every shape that I had taken out of photographs from 9 walks around New York City. And I became fascinated by these leftovers. I had thought that the sculpture itself was just going to be about the absence of the shapes, but I became fascinated with the pieces that were punched out. And I started to think about ways in which I could deal directly with them. In a sense, what I was thinking about was, instead of creating all of this information that I would try to compress into a painting, what if I took something really simple, residue from the walk, and tried to deal with it in a way so that it kind of grew up and something grew out of it. Instead of trying to compress information, trying to take something simple and allow it to grow. I began to make sort of simple drawings that relate specifically to the shapes and put them in simple configurations. And then I started to think about overlapping them to create something a little bit more complicated that would look like this. That's the template used to create this drawing. Now, all of the drawings are made by hand with simply just pencil on a drafting film, or what's sometimes referred to as mylar. So the computer rendering that I showed you is really just the internal structure, or the template, that then the decision making, then the marks are made within. So I continue to give myself a kind of parameter for where the marks are made. So if the larger grid drawings are the essential vocabulary, or the ABCs, then by the time I get to here, I'm dealing with sentences, and then by the time I get to this level of density, I'm dealing with full paragraphs. When the people at Boston Properties contacted me about the possibility of putting some work up in their lobby, it took me a minute to realize what building they were talking about. I have a sort of funny story about that. This painting here was based on a walk that I did right down Lexington Avenue in Midtown. And so a lot of the photographs that I was taking were actually of 601 Lexington and that whole building complex. So it was just ironic that now here I am 4 years later doing this work that's based on some of these shapes. So it's very, very possible that inside the chromosomes of these large pieces that are in there were photos that I had taken of that exact building back in 2005. This is one of the shapes that was punched out of the steel, and there's no question, this is 601 Lexington Avenue. So part of what I focus my attention on a lot in an environment like this is not the girders themselves, but some of the negative shape that's created by where the girders come together and frame the sky. So that sky, the shape of the sky, probably would be pulled out of one of the photographs once I got back to the studio. One of the things that I realized was starting this new work was that I didn't need complex amounts of information. And to try to go through this process of sort of squeezing that into a frame or into a space, that it was enough to just take one simple little thing and see if there was a way that I could just continue to work with it so that it would grow into the experience itself. In other words, one shape could contain the experience of the bridge. And that in fact, dealing just with that one thing, I could actually get closer to the essence of what it feels like to have your body move through an environment that is visually complicated as New York City, and a place as dynamic as this bridge. Part of what I realized that the walks do, it's a real basic thing to move your body through space. And part of that real basic activity counterbalances the studio practice. Through the making of the work, is a kind of a reconciliation of those two things, the idea of being an artist in a studio by yourself, and the idea of really confronting reality and having a real experience sort of out in the world and letting the world become part of your practice. The things that were really exciting to me about working in this space, it wasn't the sort of sterile environment of a gallery or museum. It was a public space, and especially a particularly dynamic public space where you have access coming in from the subways, people coming in from the street, and that real energy and flow of the city is very prevalent here. And I was also fascinated by just the visual access to the city outside the windows, the people moving in and out of the spaces, the people coming down the streets, people coming into the building, the light and the atmosphere and the glass. And I think that seems to be just a perfect kind of culmination of part of what I'm getting at with this work. I mean, I think visually I'm interested in making images that are both very graphic but are also very dynamic, but on another level seem to disappear. They seem to be there or not be there. I mean, I've ended up calling this work spectral variance, the idea of something ghostly or spectral, and the idea of multiplicity or variations, or like this self-generating system that as it continues to move, as it continues to grow, it gets sort of thinner and thinner. It gets less physically there and maybe more rooted in some kind of essence rather than on something that's solid or physical.